My name's Charles Pinwill. I'm here today with Oliver Heydorn to discuss inflation and to remind the public that there has been answers to inflation in the past. Inflation has more or less been permanent in human society, except particularly for one experiment in Australia where it was absolutely stopped for a few years in the most difficult period. And that's not even talked about anymore, but we're going to break that and talk about it today. Oliver has a background teaching philosophy as a professor in American universities, but of recent years he's withdrawn from that and has been involving himself with research in economics, and that is part of the reason why he's here today making this video and sharing some of his research with us. So Oliver, over to you. Where do we go from here?
Yes, well, thank you, Chess. So we're going to be talking about inflation, as you said, and the most logical place to start would be with some sort of definition, right? What is inflation? What is this phenomenon? And probably the most general definition that we can come up with is the idea that when inflation occurs, it means that there's an increase across the board in the general level of prices of goods and services.
Yeah.
So the general price level is going up. What used to be priced at $10 is now priced at $12. What used to be priced at, say, $100 is now priced at $120. And that increase in prices we call inflation. Now what that means is that each unit of currency or credit is able to buy less and less as time goes on, right? So there's a dilution in the purchasing power of each unit of currency, and that simultaneously means that the cost of living, the general cost of living, is increasing over time, and it's becoming more difficult for people to make ends meet.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Well, perhaps inflation is sometimes defined as an increase in prices accompanied by an increase in the money supply, which suggests that that's the reason for, and it very often is, the reason for the increase in prices. But of course, prices can increase for other reasons like famine or pestilence or monopoly. And then I suppose under that definition is they're just an increase in prices. So just bearing that in mind, an increase in prices may or may not be because an increase in the money supply. But when it is for an increase in the money supply, it is definitely inflation.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so we've described what inflation is, and the first observation that we should make is that it is a bad thing. Generally, it's a negative phenomenon. And the basic reason for that is when it occurs, it erodes people's purchasing power. So it erodes the purchasing power of everyone's savings. Anyone who has a bank account, who has money saved away, what they can buy with that money is going to be less and less as time goes on. It hurts those on a fixed income, so people who are on pensions or here in Australia who are on Centrelink, unless it's adjusted, they're going to have a more difficult time making ends meet. It hurts those whose wages or salaries have not been adjusted to inflation, to the increase in prices. And it hurts everyone insofar as it introduces a certain amount of uncertainty and instability in the economy. So people have a harder time planning for the future. They have a harder time making decisions about investments. And of course, it hurts borrowers who were on variable rates of interest and so forth. Now, if inflation gets worse over time, if it becomes what economists call galloping inflation or hyperinflation, then the very survival of the economy is at stake. So inflation, it's not a good thing, but it can become a very, very dangerous thing if it's allowed to get out of control. And that's something we want to sort of keep in people's minds, that it's...
Ultimately, it brings a breakdown in trust. And when scarcity prevails and there's no trust, then everybody starts to defend themselves, and the basis of all greed is scarcity, or the threat of scarcity, so you get those sort of problems. But one of the other things that inflation does is allow us to pay back our debts with lower value. It's not just the currency, well, it is the currency that loses its value, but debts can be repaid with less value. Now, it may be that interest rates and so on impinge on that, but one of the reasons I think that inflation hasn't been fought tooth and nail, because it allows people more readily to repay their debts.
Yes.
Which in a sense allows them to go on inflating the economy, because it tends to be decreased to some extent. You can keep inflating it,
right,
because the debt is being lessened somewhat. I can't really explain why we don't address ending inflation, but that could be a reason. And certainly it got to the point where economies completely break down, as they did in Germany in the 20s, and more recently in Zimbabwe, I think in the 1990s.
In Venezuela.
It was just impossible. What you could buy for a note in the morning, you need a wheelbarrow of notes in the afternoon, and this sort of thing. And it so destroyed society in Germany that, it made the population open to all sorts of outrageous auto-suggestions and calling for a strong man, and all sorts of things happened as a result of that.
Right. So this is the advantage, or the putative advantage of inflation, is basically it helps both the private sector and governments to inflate away the size of the debt. Right. So past debts then don't become quite as burdensome or quite as onerous if the general price level is going up and the money supply is being increased and so forth.
Yeah, if a bag of potatoes was worth $10 last year, and you had a debt of $10, you could pay it off with a bag of potatoes. But if a bag of potatoes is worth $20 this year because of inflation, you can pay off your $10 debt with half a bag of potatoes.
Right.
That's how it works in relation to the real world.
Right. So we would suggest basically that historically inflation, a certain rate of inflation has been tolerated, probably for this reason.
Yep.
But even so, if that gets out of hand, the whole economy is threatened.
Yeah.
So,
The whole thing can fall down. And that's happened quite often. There's a lot of illusory things that happen with inflation too. Like people think they're getting richer because the price of their house is going up in numbers. But if they sell their house, they'll only get enough money to buy a house of equal value, no matter what the inflation rate is, If it's
just a one-for-one sort of
That's
exchange.
right. They've only got the price of the house in that economy of that value, and you can't buy a house and buy two of the same value. All you're doing is getting inflated numbers. And that can be of advantage if you're going to go and live in a tent, because you get enough money to buy a lot of hamburgers and Coca-Colas.
And other things. Certainly in my country that wouldn't be a viable option because it's too cold.
It's a bit cold there, Yeah, well, that's right. Well, we could probably do a bit better in Agunya here. But still, it's fairly difficult to live in a modern world if you haven't got a roof over your computer,
All right, so the next thing that I wanted to discuss is what are the causes of inflation. And we've touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth exploring again. The most common explanation for the phenomenon of inflation is what is referred to as demand pull, right? So some people will say, well, if inflation is happening, it's because There's too much money chasing too few goods.
That's it.
Right? So when the money supply is increased to a greater extent than what the productive and consumptive activities of the economy require or can handle, we end up with too much money chasing too few goods. And retailers are sensitive to this. They see that consumers are demanding more and more, and there's more money in their pockets. So to take advantage of that situation, they increase their prices, and that absorbs the surplus, right? Reestablishing a balance between the money available and the prices of goods and services, the general price level. And as they do that, then demand will subside. So that's basically the idea that the money supply increases, and so we've got to increase prices to keep the two in balance, and that's demand pull. Now, there is a second form or second cause of inflation that's being recognized more and more, which is cost push. And in the case of cost push, it's not the increase in the money supply that's driving the increase in prices, but rather something else has happened on the supply side, which is causing producers and retailers to increase prices. So generally, something's happened at the level of costs. Maybe there's, as you were saying, there's some event that's occurred, like a natural disaster or a war, or there have been disruptions in the supply chains, the supply lines. There's been disruptions in distribution, and because of this, to cover increased costs, retailers have to up their prices. So we have an example of this in Australia, which is pertinent to what we'll be discussing soon about possible ways of addressing inflation or solving the inflation problem. During the Second World War in Australia, there was a transfer of efficient labor from regular productive industry to war activities, war services. And this increased the cost of production because industry had to make do with labor that was less skilled, less experienced, and so they were less efficient. And as a result, costs went up, right? They needed to work them longer hours in order to get the same level of output.
We took 500,000 of our most able people and put them in uniform, which has made a big difference. There's just one thing about the cost push and demand pull. I remember clearly one Christmas Eve, I was shopping with my wife, and there were an enormous number of shoppings in this shopping centre, quite an upmarket shopping centre, and the goods were pouring out, and they were replacing them. There was nothing like a shelf. Every shelf was absolutely chockers. And then I was reminded of the idea that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. But too few goods wasn't evident. The goods were just seemingly inexhaustible at that time and place.
Right.
And okay, there might have been a bit of money around, but these things have got to be borne in mind.
Yes. And a further complication is that whether you're dealing with, let's say, demand pull or cost push, there's another aspect of cost push which tends to enter the picture, and that is that if people can't, let's say because interest rates have gone up and they're paying more on their mortgages and this sort of thing, if they can't meet the cost of living as they're acquainted or used to doing, one of the things that they'll do is they'll go to their employer and they'll demand wage increases or salary increases in order to maintain sort of lifestyle that they're used to. This might provide a sort of temporary relief, but in the end it's no solution because those increases have to be met in increased prices eventually.
The consumer pays all costs.
Consumer pays all costs.
He pays all costs. If they're private costs, he pays in prices. If company costs, he pays it in prices. And if it's government cost, he pays it in taxes.
Right.
The consumer pays everything.
Right.
Ultimately.
So if we increase wages and increase salaries in order to give people more money, eventually that's going to filter into increased consumer prices as well. And so it's no permanent solution. There's a danger of falling into a wage price spiral, which is another form of cost push, essentially.
That's right.
Yeah. We'll talk now a little bit about remedies for inflation. And I thought probably it would be best, of course, to start with the conventional remedies, or rather the conventional remedy, because it appears that there's only one tool left in their toolkit for dealing with this, and that is that whenever inflation appears to be happening, and they say, oh, there's too much money chasing too few goods, and inflation is greater, let's say, than 2%, that's the target that the central banks aim for, the conventional response is to raise the interest rates. This will have the effect of tightening everyone's belts, so anyone who has any kind of debt will have to, if it wasn't locked in, they'd have to pay more for, let's say, mortgage loans, car loans, business loans, credit cards, and taxes to service government loans. And that, of course, increases the cost of living. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that by increasing those costs, we can mop up some of this extra money that's laying about that is somehow contributing to too much money chasing too few goods.
I see it as a situation where what government authorities have is it's a one-trick pony. Mm. They've got this one trick, which is to put up interest rates. Now, if you put up interest rates, of course, it increases cost push. Industry has more costs. And, of course, those with house mortgages get severely savaged, so they tend to spend less. So what the answer to inflation now, when you analyse it right down, is that the answer is to sicken the economy. If it gets sicker, where people have to tighten their belts, hold back from properly using the economy fully, then that will dampen it down. And if it's like most things that are a bit sick, they tend to slow up a bit, and they can tell themselves that they're stopping inflation. They're actually stopping the economy, but one of its side effects is that prices tend to slow up in rising, if not fall, and very seldom they don't fall.
Right.
This never made them fall, but it does slow up the rise.
The rate of inflation.
And when it gets below a certain rate of 2 or 3%, or whenever they're happy, they decide that they'll let the economy become a little more well again, so that it can start to operate a little bit more like normally.
Right.
And they're not trying to stop inflation. Nobody talks about stopping inflation. They talk about controlling it. They only want to control it. They don't want to stop it.
So there's a lot of collateral damage that's involved with this method of trying to slow the rate of inflation, right? You've got bankruptcies.
You've got
stress. People lose their jobs.
Yeah.
People lose their
marriages
homes.
break down.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of side effects
Fallout.
like that, which, if there is a means of stopping inflation, that's all unnecessary. You don't have to make the economy sick to control inflation.
Yes. I was thinking that this method of trying to respond to the threat of inflation is sort of analogous to the use of chemotherapy in allopathic medicine, because when someone has a cancer diagnosis and you go to a conventional doctor to treat it, the whole idea is that we will inject your body with poisonous chemicals in the hope that these poisonous chemicals will kill the cancer cells before it kills the healthy cells.
Yes.
Right? And so that's why chemotherapy is such a terrible, unpleasant experience for a lot of people, because you are injecting yourself with something that's not supposed to be there.
Yep.
And so it's somewhat analogous in that they realize inflation is a problem beyond a certain level.
Yep.
And they're trying to reduce it. But there's a lot of fallout there before they can declare the threat has passed and we can return to something resembling normalcy.
Yeah, stop curing the thing so that the patient can become normal and healthy again.
Yes. Yes.
It's a bit like that. And if it's wholly unnecessary, well, that's another matter. And we believe it is wholly unnecessary, of course, because there is another way.
So there is a way that we can bring down inflation, an alternative remedy which we want to introduce at this point, because we've seen that the conventional remedy has its disadvantages, to put it mildly. And this remedy is not purely theoretical, because it actually was in use in Australia during the Second World War, and we'll talk about that more in a moment in greater detail. But the basic idea is that we can reverse progressive inflation by reducing prices via a consumer price discount program, right? So during the Second World War in Australia, this was the policy that the government decided to follow, and it not only stopped inflation, to some extent it even reduced prices at one point. We'll talk a little bit more about the details of the program in a moment, but the basic idea is that when you have a system of consumer price discounts, you are reducing or lowering the price to the consumer without penalizing the producer. So this results in a real increase in purchasing power for the consumer without having to increase wages and salaries. And it also means that we don't have to enter into this crazy wage price spiral, because we recognize the consumer needs more purchasing power, but we're not doing it by increasing costs. We're giving the consumer a rebate, and basically the government or the public authority is making up the difference to the producer. So the producer's not out of pocket, and the consumer benefits because prices are not increasing.
Well, the situation during the war is that they couldn't stop spending because the war effort had to be maintained, and that was not negotiable. So they were increasing the money supply considerably and spending it to keep everybody fully employed in the war effort. Now, when the war started in September 1939, what they used as the Consumer Price Index, they called it the C-Index series at the time, was at a level of 100. And when the war started, they introduced a whole lot of price controls. You couldn't just put a price on something. You had to get the government's consent to charge a certain amount. So they tried to control inflation by putting price controls on it. And they went across the board on just about everything. So from starting with a consumer price index, we can call it, of 100, 3 3/4 years later, the prices had increased to 1,248. So starting at 1,000, we got to 1,248 in less than 4 years. With all the price controls and all the wartime powers, and everybody was happy to give the government those wartime powers. They thought they were essential, but it doesn't work like that. The price you can charge for an item is $1. But the costs of producing it go to $1.20. You got two choices. You either say, yes, you can increase the price to $1.20, or you can say, no, you can't, in which case the item is not produced. So really price control was just a yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full type of mechanism. It didn't work. It could never work, because you can control the top price, but you can't control the bottom price without stopping production altogether. So John Curtin was the Prime Minister, and he'd been influenced by the thinking of C.H. Douglas as a younger man before he went into politics. I've had this personally from old supporters of Douglas in Western Australia, right back in the 70s and 80s. And so he decided he wasn't going to control inflation, he was going to stop it. So he introduced these discounts, he used some of the money being issued to fund the war effort, he used some of it to discount down prices. For instance, household electricity was discounted down. They had a discount on the price of potatoes. They used that money to decrease the sales tax from 12.5% down to 7.5%. And so prices started to fall. They didn't start putting interest rates up and costs up to control inflation. They actually brought prices down to control inflation. They brought them down to stop inflation, and it did. Having gone from 1,000, index of 1,000 in September 1939, in June 1943, 3.5 years later, inflation was up from 25% from the beginning of the war at 1,248 index. And then they introduced those discounts we've talked about. 1.75 years later, it had gone down from 1,248 to 1,229. A small decrease, 1.4%, but it's going the other direction. It's never gone the other direction any time in Australian history other than that, and you can't find it in other countries either. And that was at the most difficult time that we ever had to control inflation, because we had to keep spending on the war effort. You know, we had to keep everybody fully there or we'd go out of existence altogether. So the thing worked. Unfortunately, having done that magnificent thing and proven that this thing works, John Curtin died largely of overwork in 1945, and as soon as he did, they stopped this. So it went from 1,229 in September 45. 2 years later, it was 1,310. It had gone up 17%. So we had inflation running at quite high levels till they introduced these discounts. When they stopped them, it went on rising at quite high levels, and it's never stopped. So you can stop it, but you've got to mean to stop it. And you've got to give up ideas of trying to control it and trying to sicken the economy by putting up interest rates, which really impacts on people with mortgages. And also, you were saying it forces industry to subsidise prices. Can you tell me what you're saying there, please?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that if you look at the conventional method, the conventional remedy for inflation, yes, it's absorbing money from consumers and from producers in prices, and also ultimately in taxation as well, because as prices go up, let's say the sales tax, the percentage that's taken in sales tax is going to increase as well. So you end up with a situation where consumers are lacking in purchasing power. They can't maintain the standard of living. They can't buy the things that they were accustomed to buying. And so businesses, in order to survive in that environment, what are their choices? One of the things that they can do is to not increase prices in keeping with their costs, but to basically subsidize the consumer out of their own private stores of capital for however long that they can do that, in the hope that business conditions will eventually improve. And so that is essentially what's happening, is that the raising of interest rates is forcing businesses to provide something like a consumer price discount.
Businesses to sell at a loss so they can keep going.
Correct.
And that tends to bring prices down to some extent. But it's depreciating, it's taking away from businesses' reserves or adding to businesses' debts. And as soon as that stops, of course, that's all got to be replaced. So we go rushing ahead again.
So the advantage of what we're proposing is that it benefits not just the consumer, but also the business world.
That is right. It's the thing that works. And the amazing thing about this is that those figures we're quoting are from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, though these numbers were put down in the annual yearbook, number 37, which was produced in 1946 and 47. And they gave a full account of this whole process and what it meant and how it stopped inflation and how it didn't when it wasn't used. And So it's authoritative. It's not us saying this. This is the official government publication saying, yes, we can stop inflation. We have done it. This is exactly how we've done it.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yes.
But the amazing thing is now, nobody will even refer to it. I haven't seen a mention in this. I've known about this, I don't know, 30, 40 years. I've never seen it mentioned in the major media.
Right.
This is something that never happened. You could never stop inflation. No, you can't stop it. We just try to control it. Somehow we've got to say, well, hang on. Let's go back to number 37. It's easy to discover there, and it's quite well explained and fully explained. And when we've had enough, when we're sick of inflation, we want to stop it, we can do it. But if we go on saying people, well, we want some of it or a bit of it and we'll control it and we won't let it get out of hand, it's going to go on forever.
Yes. The other interesting thing is the Curtin government was a Labour government.
Yep.
And we have a Labour government in power in Australia now, so it behooves them to look at their predecessors and see, it was Labour policy at one time.
Yeah, that's right.
So why can't it be revitalized?
But they were a different world, and they're a bit more practical in those times. And the reason that John Curtin did it, because it worked. You're welcome to do whatever you like about inflation.
Yes.
If you're not going to do what works, what do you expect? And it's a bit sad they don't acknowledge the greatness of their earlier people. I remember, this is just an aside if you like, one day I was talking to the bagman of the National Party, the arch Tories in Queensland. This is a bloke who used to go around and collect money for them, from businesses and so on. And he'd been around a long time. He used to give advice about protocol and things like that when they were visiting dignitaries. So he was associated with government a long time in Queensland. And I said to him, who's your favourite Prime Minister? This is a Tory. He said, John Curtin. John Curtin was head and shoulders over the lump. He knew Bob Menzies, he knew all the rest of them.
Yep.
John Curtin was his man. So this is a guy we need to go back and find those genuine heroes that weren't phonies and apply
the
things that work.
Yes.
Let's try that. In desperation, we might try something that'll work.
That actually works. Yeah. So one objection that is probably going to be raised at this point to the idea of introducing consumer price discounts to neutralize inflation would be, where is the money going to come from? If this means increasing public debt, then eventually that public debt is going to have to be serviced, and so you'll be giving with one hand and taking back with the other. And is this really a long-term solution? Now, as far as I understand it, yes, the Labour government during the Second World War did manage to stop inflation and even to reverse inflation. But it was done purely within the realm of orthodox finance. And there's an important piece of the puzzle here where we want to suggest, yes, price discounts are the way to go, but we can do something even better than what the Curtin government did insofar as through introducing some form of monetary change, monetary reform, we can actually fund it in a way that is not going to increase the public debt and so will not put a burden on, let's say, future generations.
What we're saying is that it's possible to think outside the box. It is possible. As to how we fund discounts on prices, we can fund them the same way that everything is financed. Everything is financed by banks creating credit. The primary function of banks is to create and, yes, to destroy money. When they make loans, that increases the amount of deposits that are there because the loans are spent. And bank deposits are what we use as money now. Not notes, not coins, very little, less than 2%. Our money supply is bank deposits. Now, they create bank deposits when they make loans. And you know, when they insist that they're paid back, that destroys money. So what we're saying is that it's possible, if we're going to look at creating money, which we are, and it's the only way we get it, we can create it with a plus sign in front of it or a negative sign. If it's got a negative sign, it's debt and it's got to be repaid. If it's a plus sign, it can go into the economy and actually cancel out some of the debt. So we can create money with a positive sign in front of it that will not only reduce prices and stop inflation, stop it, not control it, stop it. It will also negate and cancel out the amount of debt in society to the same amount, because you can only cancel a negative with a positive. That's all that will do it. So then the whole cost structure starts to come down. So we can do better than they did during the war. At least we could do that. If we did nothing more, at least it would be a big help. But we can go better again by financing it with positive money, not negative money.
There's a real opportunity, in other words, not only to deal properly with this problem of inflation, but actually to set the whole economy on a much more sound and satisfactory basis.
Yeah. To roll back the enormous structure of debt, where, you know, I'm told the debt in the world now is 200 trillion. The American debt is $90 trillion. I mean, debt is going up every year, and they think that it has to go up because otherwise we won't have enough money to keep going. So we've got to keep creating more debt because that's the only way we can get money at the moment, and we've got to have money to keep going. So it's a bloody madness. We need to think about ways to stop it, and it is stoppable. Debt is stoppable in the same way that inflation is stoppable, you know, and it comes down to simple techniques that are logical and obvious that aren't aimed at preserving vested interests, as a lot of this business of keeping the debt system going because powerful bankers want it and others live off it and so on, and mortgages keep a lot of people employed and all the rest of it.
Yes.
You know, we've got to confront these things head on and push that sort of thing aside and say, well, let's make it work properly and we'll go on from there.
Well, sounds good to me.
My name's Charles Pinwill, and Oliver Heydorn and myself are going to address ourselves to a concept of universal basic income and to whether it constitutes a long-term threat to personal freedoms. And we've attempted to equip ourselves in understanding what universal basic income is. In 2018, we attended the main world conference of universal basic income called BIG, Basic Income Guarantee. And again, we attended the same conference in New York in 2019. And we addressed groups there, we discussed the matter, and we've equipped ourselves to know what we're talking about. Today we're raising questions about it, which are not hitherto raised. The main reason we're doing that is that from many quarters we're getting the information that artificial intelligence is now eliminating so many jobs that many prominent authorities are saying we're going to have to introduce universal basic income. It's true, we're going to have to do something about people's income. We're not objecting to that. But what we're saying is it has to be done in a certain way. If it's done in the wrong way, it can undo a lot of the good that's there potentially.
Yeah, so we might start off just with an introduction to what this is exactly. Some people that maybe are not familiar with it or haven't had a chance to learn about it. And it's something that admits of a variety of different interpretations and applications, but basically the idea is that everyone, whether they're employed or not, will be given a certain amount of income by the government or by some state body on a regular basis. And the intention, I think, is that it would be sufficiently high to guarantee that their basic costs of living would be met. So that's the essential concept of a universal basic income. Now, our concerns about it center on, to begin with, the question of how are you going to finance it, because it can be financed in ways which don't actually make us better off, don't make the society or the economy as a whole better off, or it can be financed in ways that actually constitute genuine progress. And so, unfortunately, most of the academics, politicians, pundits that talk about universal basic income, they're thinking of it purely in terms of conventional finance. So in order to fund the program, you would have to either source the money through taxation, or you would have to source it through an increase in public indebtedness. And so if you look at taxation first, a lot of the supporters for universal basic income say, well, if we use the existing taxation system, however we might tweak it to fund it, we might be able to save money by getting rid of other, let's say, social programs that are no longer required. They might become redundant or be replaced by universal basic income. But I would argue that at the end of the day, it's just redistribution. You're just taking basically from some segments of the population who have to those who have not, because some people will be net beneficiaries of the program and others will be net losers, essentially.
The two big problems with doing it through tax. One is, if you're doing it through the universal basic income recipients, you're giving it with one hand and you're taking it back with the other, and you're achieving absolutely nothing. It's a waste of time. You're just making administrative mischief out of the whole thing. Another option is to tax the employed. Now, some people are saying, and they may be right, that ultimately half of the population will be replaced in employment through artificial intelligence. And just to take that as an exaggerated situation, perhaps for the moment, if we're going to tax the employed, then the employed are going to have to get two basic incomes. One to pay the tax to the other person that needs it, and one to retain it for himself. So that makes employment very expensive. And what that means is every employer will be racking their brains how they stop employing so many. It more or less subsidises, compels, certainly encourages unemployment and exacerbates it. So taking the tax off the recipients makes no sense. Taking it off those that are going to pay all the tax out of their incomes doesn't make a lot of sense either.
Well, it incentivises more automation, more
That's
artificial
right.
intelligence.
It incentivises
Yes,
eliminating
there'll
employment.
be fewer people available who are employed to be
That's
taxed. And so,
And there's not many other options when you get to tax. You could tax industry, you could tax the self-employed, you could tax business and industry. Okay, fine. But how would they pay that tax? They pay their taxes by increasing prices. So what they're going to have to do is increase their prices, which will flow into consumer goods, to pay the tax. Who pays the price of consumption and consumer goods? It's going to be, you guessed it, in the main, the recipients. So it's a bit of a zero-sum game, this business of paying it out of tax. Now, it's a bit the same if you say, all right, well, we'll pay it out of tax. Yeah. That means you don't have to pay it just now, but later on you've got to pay it in full, and you've got to pay interest as well. So really, that could lead us into a situation where the whole world, if you like, is totally meshed in debt. They can't stop running more and more into debt because there's no other way to finance people just to have a basic income.
Yes, and of course...
So then we're enslaved to the debt masters.
Yes, and debt has to be serviced. So this ties in with the other video that we did today about inflation.
Yeah.
Where if we try to fund it through debt, ever-increasing debt, and the debt has to be serviced, taxes will have to go up to cover it, and so on and so forth. And in that way, UBI would actually be inflationary.
That's right. We'd have more taxes, more debt, and more inflation. We'd sort of be enslaved to those things unless they're addressed. So we're here today to try to make a few suggestions about handling this in a different way.
We're not at all opposed to the concept of people getting an income that's somehow delinked from employment status or delinked from work.
Certainly not.
We're not philosophically opposed to that. And from a more practical standpoint, we recognize that the economy, given the way that it's structured, given the way that it functions, both the economy and the citizens require an income that's delinked from work. Right? So that basic principle or that aspect of it, we don't have any objection to. It's just a question of how is it going to work in practice. So we have this major issue with the funding, and what we want to suggest is that as an alternative to conventional means of finance, taxation, or increasing the public debt, it is possible to conceive of a change, let's say, in national accounting, whereby we could give everyone something like a basic income, but do it with a change in how money is created. So instead of creating it as a debt, as a repayable credit, we actually could create credit that is not linked to a debt, doesn't have to be repaid. And the economy actually needs that input of a debt-free volume of money. And this would not be inflationary. It would be anti-inflationary. We can explain that perhaps a little later. And it wouldn't have the drawbacks that we've just been looking at in case of taxation and in case of...
Money can be created pretty much in the same way as that we create ballots when election time comes. We can create enough so we all get one each. We could create money if we set up a National Credit Authority. We've got electoral offices, a National Electoral Office. If we set up a National Credit Authority, they could make calculations about what's necessary in terms of basic income, or as we prefer to call it, a national dividend. And once that's known, they could be empowered to issue credit, not as debt, and not owing to anybody. Of course, it will make demands on the economy, and in that general sense, it's a liability on the economy, but it's not a repayable liability that has to be added into cost later. That's basically the suggestion. We need to rethink the thing, fund it in a different way that doesn't tax the recipients, it doesn't make any sense, tax the employee, which disincentives employment, or add to debt interminably. And once you head down that road of increasing debt as the only way to do this, there's nowhere to go except to continue that through years, through decades, and necessary through centuries, until the mortgagees will really run the world unashamedly, and there'll be nothing we can do about it except comply and go back and ask for more. And if they don't give it to us, well, our goose is cooked. And that's not place to be. We need to be in command. We need to be in command of our own credit, and that's what we're proposing. Special National Credit Authority with court-like powers. It would have to be structured constitutionally so that it can't get out of control. But if we're going to have a universal basic income, we've got to address at that level, or we're going to end up perhaps worse off than we are now.
Right. So we have a situation where artificial intelligence, automation are displacing people from work. People are losing their jobs. We anticipate that a lot of people, their jobs will be replaced, not in the too far distant future. And obviously we need to have a way of providing for those people so that they retain access to goods and services, even though their labor is no longer required by the formal economy. But we have to be very careful to make sure that in doing that, we are actually protecting people's civil rights, we're protecting their freedom, we're enhancing their freedom, and we're not creating a situation where because they don't have employment or don't have self-employment, that maybe through the way we finance it, we're not actually setting up a kind of slavery system where the society as a whole becomes, is in pawn to financiers, for example, because
at every level, like individually, we're debt slaves, and government itself is a debt slave unless they can set up right institutions to handle this thing properly. I mean, kings of old used to coin the money. Now, coins aren't money, bank deposits are money, but even then, the notes and coins that are made are sold to the banks at very moderate rates, and in the most part, the mints lose money. They've lose money many years. So the old kings used to create the money, but that's done by a banking system now, and it's done in cyberspace. And if we can do it in cyberspace, it's cheap to do, but we've got to look at who has the sanctions, who has the control over that, who imposes the limitations and the conditions. And unless we'll address that, we get ourselves in a big mess here.
Yes, one of the assumptions of, let's say, orthodox finance, conventional finance, which is shared by UBI proponents, is the assumption that whatever costs and prices are built up in the economy in the course of production, that there's automatically a sufficient amount of consumer income that's being distributed as wages, salaries, dividends to offset the costs and prices. These things are sort of automatically in balance. And what we are suggesting is that actually that is not the case.
It is not the case.
There is a gap between the rate at which costs and prices are built up in the economy versus the rate at which incomes are automatically distributed from the same productive processes. And the existing system generally fills that gap with more and more debt.
That's right.
But if we recognize that what that actually means on a physical level, if we're producing so much in value in terms of goods and services per annum, and we're only being paid a lesser amount automatically to produce it, then that means that society is actually making a profit, right? We're making more with less. And so,
but it can't afford to buy its profit.
But it can't afford to buy its profit under the existing setup, the existing system.
That's right.
What we're proposing is actually if you change the institutions and the mechanism of money, we can actually monetize the gap with debt-free credit and distribute that as a dividend. And it's called a dividend because the whole point is, from our philosophical point of view, the citizens should be regarded as shareholders, as proprietors. And so this way of financing a basic income would actually be built on the idea that we don't go to the state or the government as beggars, as something must be done because we don't have employment, but rather the economy is something we own, and so it's in a matter of justice.
We're the proprietors of this country, and therefore, if there is a profit, who does it belong to? It belongs to the people. We're all shareholders with one share at par value, so everybody, irrespective of all other considerations, gets one share. And the reason this is terribly necessary is that incomes and costs are created at the same time. If somebody's employed to create a mine, income's there, but the cost flows through into the metal and into the machine and so on. And eventually maybe you get a can of baked beans out of that. But that was 5 years ago, that the cost of the mine. It might be 10 years or more. So the cost and the income are created at the same time. But if you take your income and you pay off your house mortgage, that deposit disappears. So incomes disappear at a rate much faster than costs. Costs will go on until a consumer consumes a consumer product and cannot pass the cost on for that reason. He eats the baked beans and that's it.
Yeah.
But the incomes are gone before the baked beans hit the market. So that's a simple way of saying it, but you've just got to address that. That's the reason, ultimately, why we need a universal basic income, because we've just got to have it. The reason we need it is that we are really profitable. We're only spending a certain amount in income to produce a lot more in terms of consumer goods. It's a dynamic thing, but unless we address it, we're in deep trouble. And unless we address it in the right way, without going into debt and exacerbating it, then we're not going to come out of this.
Yes.
You can't even apologise for the fact that this is a bit difficult to understand. Society doesn't have an alternative to understand this. If we don't address it, we're either going to starve in the hedgerows or be enslaved in a debt and indebted societies with indebted governments, indebted persons, indebted industry, more or less forever, with no option to come out of that.
Yes, and closely connected with that sort of financial pressure, financial situation, is the concern that many people have voiced that if a lot of people, 50% of the population, no longer have the opportunity of working for a living, and so they're dependent on this thing for their survival. If there's no recognition, no real recognition, either in theory or in practice, that people are owed this as a matter of justice, just as being citizens and shareholders in their economy, that the government may believe that it has the right to put conditions on the receipt of the basic income that people depend on for survival.
That's total slavery.
And that's total slavery. So they might say, for example, well, yes, we'll give you a basic income, but you've got to do A, B, C, or not do D, E, and F in order to get it. And then they use that as a control mechanism. And that, of course, is...
Once employment is gone, it's got to be substituted with something. And Elon Musk reckons that it's coming in big time. He's been working on automating motor vehicles, and what they're saying in his presentations, in his videos, is that this has reached such a point. They've had to learn so much about automating production and processes that unemployment is coming very high levels. So it's an issue of the time. We're going to have to confront it. And we can get it wrong in many ways. We can't surrender freedom in order to escape starvation.
In order to gain...
We've got to escape starvation, certainly.
Yeah.
But if we surrender freedom, then that really is the end of the organism, really. It's just an automation after that that's played like a piano by the debt manipulators. And that's hell, and probably not in a basket, We've got to get our head around the institutions we need, national credit authorities, creating credit on the basis they can only distribute to the shareholders of the country, which are the citizens. And there's more to that for another day, but that's how it has to be hit.
So a national dividend financed through the introduction of debt-free credit, distributed as an unconditional right, is the direction we should be moving in.
That's right. Yeah. And not really different to a basic income, except in how it's done, and except of the fallout, the implications to society and its freedom orientation. So we're doing the same thing, but we want to do it on different terms.